Do you think this is true? We often think more of ourselves than we trust in God. We often trust in our own understanding more than what God says. What do you think? We're instructed in Proverbs 3, verses 5 to 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will smooth the way for you. Something similar was told to the kings of Israel in Deuteronomy 17. There's instructions. Long before there was any king in Israel, God told the Israelites about selecting a king and gave rules and instructions there. God said that each king was to take a copy of the law and write their own copy. And they were to read it all the days of their lives so that they would trust in God, that it would go well with Him. And specifically, the kings were told, don't multiply horses. Not that horses are evil, but for them, horses are the nuclear bombs of the day, Don't multiply horses was trust in the Lord, not in military might. And don't multiply wives. And we think of the morality issue, but it wasn't a morality issue. It was a trust in God issue. Because what would happen is that this nation would make peace with Israel, and in order to secure that peace, they would give the king a wife. And so Solomon had all of those wives because all of these nations had allied themselves with Israel. And so God says, don't multiply horses and don't multiply wives for the same reason. Not to suggest that wives and horses are the same, but they did have that commonality of trust in God. Don't trust in your own understanding. Don't trust in your own strength. And so for Israel, faith in God would be their shield and their protection, not trust in their military might or their alliances. And although I personally think that having a strong national military is important, our security is not going to come through a $600 billion defense budget. Neither will it come through alliances with other nations. Whether it's on a national level or on a personal level, we have a tendency, though, to look to ourselves and trust in ourselves rather than looking to God. God calls us to serve Him. And instead of simply obeying Him, we sometimes sidestep with our reasons and excuses why we can't serve God the way He wants us to serve Him. We're not so different than Moses was at the burning bush. When Moses was called to serve, he was reluctant. Are we sometimes reluctant? When called to serve, he was hesitant. God sent him, and instead of obeying, he asked questions. And God says He chose Moses, He chose him to serve Him. And Moses attempted to explain why God had made the wrong choice. In our own understanding, we sometimes counter what God has mandated. Did God really make a mistake? Here's God talking to Moses, and God says, Moses, go. And Moses says, I think you're sending the wrong God. And we laugh because we relate. God says, go into all the world and make disciples. And you say, oh yeah, the pastor will do that. God certainly doesn't mean me. And we come up with all sorts of ideas and excuses. Most of us are familiar with the basic story of the life of Moses. He was adopted, literally plucked out of a watery grave in the Nile River and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised in the education of the Egyptians while knowing that he was a Hebrew. He spent 40 years of his life as an Egyptian. We don't know a lot about that, but we do know that he was. And when he was 40 years old, he chose to identify with the Israelites rather than the Egyptians. And he went out and saw what was going on, and he killed an Egyptian in order to try to deliver his people. And then he ran away. And for 40 years, he was a shepherd. Had a wife, had a couple kids. And then one day, while following around after the sheep, there was a bush that was burning. And it was a curiosity for Moses, and he goes to look. And when he goes to look, God speaks to him. And here in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is 80 years old. He lives to be 120. So 2/3 of his life is gone. He's about retirement age, so I suppose, right? And God calls him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. But like us, when God calls us to serve, He dragged His feet. His responses to God include things like this. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Who will I tell the people you are? What if the people won't believe me? I don't have the ability to do this job. I never have had the ability to do this job. And if God calls you to do something, sometimes when I ask people to do something, I hear those things. Huh? Our problem is the same as what Moses had. Moses was focused on himself instead of looking to God. Moses said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? It's the wrong question. Who will I tell the people you are? What if the people won't believe me? You see, the focus, right? All of his objections were not about who God was or what God was calling him to do. All of his objections were about him. We are that self-centered person, aren't we? It's about us. It's not about God. If we look carefully, and we're going to read it here in a moment, if we look carefully at what God said to Moses, it really wasn't about Moses at all. It was about who God was. The focus was on God. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 6 to 10, it records what God said to Moses when he appeared at the bush. And God told Moses everything that Moses needed to know to take the next step forward. You know, we want to know everything. We don't want to know what does God want us to do now. We want to know, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And what about this? We want the whole game plan laid out and all tied up in a ribbon. And God just says, trust me and go. Take one step. And there's a step. And go, well, I don't want to take that step because what's the next step? And where's the end of that, right? Isn't that true? As we look at what God said to Moses, we want to see that we can have confidence in God. And we can have the confidence to serve God wholeheartedly and enthusiastically. And so as we read these verses, I want us to notice how the focus is on God and not on Moses. So let's read together, starting in verse 6. He's at the burning bush. He's got his shoes off now. He's bowed down before God. And God says to Moses this in verse 6. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people in Egypt, and I have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. Verse 8, so I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from the land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to a place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. And now, behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. How much of that was about God, and how much of it was about Moses? And yet, as you read the rest of chapter 3 and chapter 4, Moses is like, me, 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 me. When God said, all of these things. Our confidence is to be in God. Our excuses arise from looking at ourselves. Our faithful service arises from having a confident faith in God. So what has God given us that we can take the next step in trusting Him? Well, we want to look at several confidences that help us trust God and take that next step. And the first confidence that we can have is in who God is, His identity, and His history. And so we see here in verse 6, God says to Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And so, of course, these are individuals who were Moses' ancestors. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Israel had 12 sons. One of those sons was Levi. Moses was a descendant of Levi. It's been a long time, though, since God dealt with Abraham. Matter of fact, it's been a long time since the Israelites went down to Egypt. And we saw last week how there was like 70 of them had gone down to Egypt. Now they had grown into a great nation. Millions of people, several million people. Just as God had promised that He would make Abraham, this man who had no children, this man who had a wife who was unable to have children, and they were both old, and God gave them a son. Just as He promised. And from that son, Isaac, was born Jacob, and from Jacob was born the 12 sons of Israel, and from the 12 sons of Israel, now they've grown into a great nation. And when he says, I am the God of your father, there's a whole history there. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, God had a relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and in that relationship, God made promises to them, and in those promises, God demonstrated who He was, that what He said He would do, He would do. And so somewhere along the line, God had given to Moses the book of Genesis that recorded the history of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Perhaps it was before this burning bush experience. I'm kind of inclined to think that maybe when he was still in Egypt, before he killed the Egyptian and ran away, that God gave him Genesis, and that was the promises. We don't know. However, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what we have in Genesis is this record of who God is. He's the creator. He made everything. He judges sin. He divided the nations. He made these promises to Abraham. And now He's in the process of fulfilling these promises. Genesis is not just history. It's not just stories. It's a story about God's promises. It's a story about one of the sons of Israel going to Egypt and how God brought the Israelites there and God provided for them. It's not just the story of Joseph, how he became a ruler and stored up food for 7 years of famine. It's about how God was working His plan and purpose. How God kept promises that can be trusted. And so God is saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'm sending you to Pharaoh to fulfill my promises. Moses says, I'm not so sure. You see, God used the burning bush to get Moses' attention, but really the bush is not that significant. We try to figure out, well, why did it burn and why did it not burn up and all of these things. And we overlook the fact that God is calling Moses here and calling him to serve, and Moses is like, I don't really want to. And God says, I am the God of your father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can trust me. Remember Abraham. Remember the promises. Remember how I've kept the promises. You see, when we look at ourselves, we're like, But when we look at God, then those reluctance and hesitancies fade away. We can have confidence in God because of who He is and because of what He's done and what He's done in time and in history. If we look at ourselves, we go to one too extreme. If we look at ourselves, we become so proud and so arrogant that we march off in our own flesh and try to do it in our own strength and make a big mess out of it. Or if we look at ourselves and we're a little bit more honest with ourselves and we say, I can't do this. Who am I? And so we go to one of two extremes. But if we look at God, we see ourselves as not worthy, as not able, but know that God is. And if God says, I've chosen you to do this, then we do it not because of ourselves, but we do it because of who God is. God doesn't make mistakes, so we can proceed in obedience. And so we can have confidence in God of who He is and what He's done and how He's worked in history. We can also confidently trust God because He knows all things and He cares about us. He knows all things. For the Israelites, there were the glory days. And so Joseph had gone down into Egypt. He had been elevated to a very high position in the Egyptian government, and he had power and he had control, and he brought down his father and his brothers and he settled them in the best of the land. They had a favored status. And while Joseph lived and ruled, while the memory of Joseph lingered, it was wonderful. And then there came a change. Time passed. We're not talking about days here. We're talking about centuries. And there came a change. And with that change, there became hard labor and there became oppression and abuse and mistreatment for centuries. And if you were an Israelite there in Egypt, you're talking about generations here. Several generations are represented here. Some of us are touching on the Depression, right? And then there's the children of those World War I and World War II folks, and then there's the grandchildren, and there's the grandchildren of the grandchildren. And so the Israelites, they were in Egypt for centuries. The first part was good because Joseph was there and the memory is there, but then they became oppressed and they became enslaved, abused, mistreated. And if you were there at that time, if I was there at that time, we would be saying, where's God now? Right? Where's God now? Sometimes in our lives we're like that. Something happens. When things are going good and going smooth, it's like, hey, praise God. And then when something happens, boom, we're on our face. And it's like, where's God now? And I don't know that they said that, but I imagine if we were there, we would be. Where's God now? Now, where are His promises now? Doesn't God see what these people are doing to us, and doesn't He care? Can you identify with those folks? If your father was 10 years old when they came down to Egypt, and then you were born there while Joseph was still living, and then now you're an old man, an old woman, and they brought this oppression up on you, and it's like, where's God now? Aren't we His people? Isn't He going to deliver us now? Doesn't He care? Doesn't He know? If He knows, doesn't He care? And if He cares, isn't He able to do something? See, that's our understanding, right? If God isn't fixing it, if it's not fixed already, then He doesn't care, or He doesn't know, or He's not able. And the reality is, God knows, and God cares, and God is able. Look at verse 7. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction. And it wasn't that one morning God wakes up, so to speak. Not that God ever sleeps. It's hard to understand God, right? He didn't just all of a sudden say, oh, look what's happening. Right? He knew all along. He says, I have seen, at the end of verse 7, I am aware of their sufferings. Verse 9, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. In Matthew 6, talking about being anxious and talking about trusting in God, it says God knows what we need before we ask. He knows. He knows what's going on in your life. And He cares. How do we know God cares for us? You know, there's a story of Mary and Martha comes to Jesus, and Mary's sitting there, you know, just listening to Jesus, soaking it up, and she's trying to get everything ready. Then she comes to Jesus and says, "Hey, don't you care that I'm doing all the work and she's just sitting here?" You know, and sometimes we're like that with God. God, don't you care? We know God cares. We know love by this. We know that God loves us. How do we know? Because He sent His Son to die for our sins. If God will do that, God cares. Right? If He's given us the best, He'll give us the rest, as it can be said. You know, the difficulties and trials in our lives are not because God doesn't know or doesn't care or is unable to fix them. Sometimes those difficulties are God's instruments to draw us close to Him. You know, if we're honest, and sometimes we are, if we're honest, most of us will admit that we draw closer to God in the hard times than when things are going easy. When life is well oiled and the path is smooth. You know, Moses had his share of challenges in his life, didn't he? You know, he was marked for destruction as a baby. You know, we tell the story to the kids of the mom. Moses' mom made this basket and pitch and tar and put it in there and put it down by the reeds. And why did she put him in the river? Because he was going to die. That's why she put him in the river. She didn't want to just toss him in a river because that'd be inhumane, but she put him in a river to die. Put the daughter there, some hope and expectation that maybe some would happen, and in his case it did. But, you know, Moses wasn't the only kid that was put in that river. He was raised as an Egyptian knowing he was a Hebrew. Not sure how that worked. Because his mother raised him, right? He went back to his mother's house and raised him, and she nursed him. But then he was adopted by Pharaoh, and it's like... And then at some point he decided to identify with the Israelites rather than the Egyptians. There must have been some challenge and struggle associated with that. He had it made in the shade, you know, silver spoon and the whole... Or I'm going to identify with these slave people. And then he tried to help his own people. He might have been thinking this: God has put me in this position to deliver these people, so I'm going to go out and be their champion. And he kills the Egyptian, and he's trying to help them, and they're like, "Who do you think you are?" They rejected him. Wait, God has put me here. I'm in a position to help you. You know, sometimes we try to help people and we get the, right? Go away. Leave me alone. And then he fled. So he had lived 40 years, pretty cush life. And then these events happen and now he runs away. He's sitting by a well, and he goes to this guy's house, and the guy gives him a wife, and he becomes his shepherd. For a month, 6 months, 40 years. Now, he's following those sheep around. Comes to Mount Horeb, by the way. It's the same mountain where God gave him the 10 Commandments. Where the burning bush is, where Moses is. He's feeding the sheep there, and they're there, and the bush is burning, and God speaks to him, and he's 80 years old, and Moses is seemingly content to live out the rest of his life as a shepherd. He's not interested in going back to do what God is asking him, telling him to do. He's not interested in identifying with his people anymore. It's 40 years later. He's not interested in being used by God. Just let me feed the sheep, you know? Let me enjoy life. following the sheep, raise my kids, do my job. Just let me be peaceful. He says, I believe in God. He bows down. I'm the God of your father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He falls down. He's afraid to look at God. He didn't really want to go back to Egypt. If you put your faith and trust in Jesus, God has called you to be a disciple and make disciples, but many of us are just content to do what we do. Right? There are some parallels here. In all of these things, God was preparing Moses, just as He's preparing us and has prepared us to serve Him. We're instruments of God. We're clay pots, earthen vessels, it says, and we have been given the tremendous treasure of the gospel to give to others. God knows people need a Savior, just like He knew the Israelites needed to be delivered. And God cares. He cares so much He sent His Son. And He's given to you and to me that message to bring into the lives of the people around us. We can be sure of that. God knows and God cares. So are we going to be like Moses and send somebody else? I can't do this. I don't have what's needed to do it. The third confidence is that God will take action on our behalf according to His promises. We can have confidence that God will do what He has promised to do and He will act on our behalf. Look at verse 8. He knows and He is aware. In verse 8 He says, I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians. Now God is everywhere. And so when it says God has come down, it means that we should understand that He's locked and loaded. He's ready to do this. He's going to take action. He says, I will deliver them. I will bring them up. You see, those were promises that God had made. He had made to Abraham. He had told Abraham, I will give you this land. Repeated it to Isaac, repeated it to Jacob. And God had specifically told Abraham, He says, I'll give this land to your descendants, but first they're going to be enslaved for 400 years to a people they don't know. See, God foretold all of this. And then at the end of 400 years, I'm going to bring them up to this land, and they're going to come up with all of these riches from this nation that had enslaved them. And so we're at that juncture. And God says to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say, let the people go. And God had promised all of these things. And then God had even told him the time frame. God had told Abraham 400 years. And if you do the math, in Exodus 12, by the time they left Egypt, it was 430 years. So it's interesting to note, and I wondered about this as I was preparing this week, that here Moses is in Egypt, and he's in this position, and perhaps he has the book of Genesis by now, and he reads that God said to Abraham, I will bring these people up after 400 years, and he's doing the math, and it's been 390 years, and it's time. And I'm in this position, and I'm going to do it. But God wasn't quite ready yet, and maybe Moses tried to do it in his own strength rather than doing it in God's way and God's time. In Acts chapter 7, it gives us a little bit of insight. Stephen's talking about Moses, talking about the people of Israel, and in Acts chapter 7, it says that Moses killed the Egyptian, and it says this, and I quote, supposing that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him. When he killed that Egyptian, he had some understanding that God was going to use him to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. And so he marched out there boldly to do it. in his own strength. And even at that time, Moses recognized that Israel would be delivered by God, and Moses would be the one that God would use. But things went south. And Moses fled. And maybe he was disillusioned, and maybe that's why he's here at this juncture at the bush, and he's like, I already tried that, and it didn't work. And I don't really want to go there again. I don't want to do that again. I gave it my shot, and send somebody else. But now God is calling Moses, and he's like, yeah, didn't work before. I didn't even submit my resume. Why are you bothering me? We can also be confident that God is attentive to us when we call upon Him. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but if you look at chapter 2 and verse 23 of Exodus, it says, Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died. The sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel and took notice of them. In chapter 3, verse 7, he says, I have given heed to their cry. Chapter 3, verse 9, the cry of the sons of Israel has come up to me. And God is attentive to us when we cry out to Him, when we call upon Him. And if we were to read in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, it talks about praying. And it tells us to be persistent. These people probably were crying out for a long time. In Luke, it tells this story of a guy who has some visitors come in the middle of the night, and he doesn't have food to feed them, so he goes and he bangs on his friend's door, and the friend says, Go away. My kids are in bed. I got to crawl over them to get to the door. Go away, right? And he says, No. I ain't going away. And it says he won't get up and give him bread because he's his friend, but because he's so persistent. And he says, pray that way. God will answer you because you're persistent. And then he goes on to talk about God knowing how to give good things to His children. And so we're to be persistent, and we're to be confident that God will do what is good. And when we call out upon Him, call out in prayer to God. And lastly, when we are weak and incapable and unable, God is not. Right? Moses was a broken guy. He's like, I give up. Can't fight Pharaoh. The Israelites, they don't want to have anything to do with me. If I stay here, I'm going to get put to death. I'm out of here. Never looking back. And he named his son something to that effect. God has given me a deliverance, set me free. God does not call us to serve Him in any way that we cannot do. We may think we cannot. God strengthens us to do the work that He calls us to do. And so we can have confidence that God will equip us to do the work He calls us to do. Look at verse 10. He says, Come now, after all those things. In verses 6, 7, 8, and 9, God says, I will send you. And Moses says, me, instead of God. God did not ask Moses if he wanted to go. One of the mistakes that parents make, and I get after my own kids in this sometimes, is they look at that little child and say, "Do you want to go to bed now?" The kid's going to say, "No!" Right? "Do you want to eat? Do you want?" Instead, they should say, "It's time for bed. You're going to bed." God doesn't ask Moses, "Do you want to go back to Egypt now? You want to go do this?" God just says, "Go." And it's right for God to tell us that, and it says it's right for the parent to tell the child that. It's right for the boss to tell the person, "Do you want to go do this now? You want to go?" No. There's authority, submissive relationship, and we have that with God. And God says, "Moses, I'm sending you." God did not ask Moses to consider taking a job. He doesn't say, "Would you pray about this?" Right? He doesn't tell us, "Will you please pray about making disciples? Will you please pray about telling people about Jesus who died to save them? Will you please pray about how you should build up and encourage others?" He just tells us to do it. And we should. He did not offer Moses one of many options. "Would you like to go to Egypt or wherever?" He says, "I'm sending you there." He didn't ask Moses, "Hey, do you think you can do this?" He says, "Go. I'm sending you." Moses didn't want to do the work for a variety of reasons, and we can relate to some of those reasons. I'm not sure about Moses' heart motives, but I do know that when God calls us to serve, that we sometimes have motives behind our excuses. Maybe Moses felt inadequate. I mean, legitimately, he honestly, "Who am I that I should go?" Maybe he's too busy with other things. "Who's going to take care of all these sheep? My father-in-law's old now. I'm heir apparent. I'm going to inherit all this. I got to take care of this." I don't know. I don't know that was that way with Moses, but I do know that that's that way with us. Sometimes we're just content with the current state of affairs. We're just like, "Hey, life is good. Why would I do that? Why would I go and try to tell people about Jesus? Why would I try to build people up? Why would I go to church and be part of a church? Because those church people, they're a bunch of hypocrites and they don't appreciate you anyway, and they just talk bad about you behind your back and blah, 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 blah." Right? Don't want to be bothered. Want to keep life simple. Jesus told his disciples, "As the Father has sent me, so I send you." We could dwell there a long time, right? The command to make disciples in Matthew 28 is not presented as one among many options for us as Christians. It doesn't say make disciples or feed the poor or heal the sick. It says make disciples. That means telling them about Jesus and those who have trusted in Jesus, helping them to grow. That's our burning bush. What's our response? Are we like, "Send somebody else"? Huh? Or, "I can't do that"? God doesn't give us things to do that we can't do. It's a specific command with defined parameters. As you're going, baptizing people, make disciples, teaching them to do all that Jesus commanded. So if we reflect on that command as if we're in a position of Moses, maybe we don't verbalize those excuses. But nevertheless, we kind of respond like Moses did. "I'm not qualified. Send whoever you want, just somebody other than me." I tried that before. It didn't work. It didn't work for Moses in a big way, right? What's the use? What if people won't listen? What if people don't know who you are? So do we say those things, or do we say, yes, Lord? Where? How? With whom shall I go? God hasn't sent us to deliver a nation. But He has sent us to people, to individuals, that they might be delivered from their slavery to sin and their slavery to the devil. That's what He's called us to do. God doesn't ask us to do everything. Just take one step at a time because we trust in Him. And He's given us what we need to have confidence in Him. We look to God. And when we do, we can have confidence that we need to serve Him the way He should be served. If we look to ourselves, then we're like Moses, filled with excuses, offering all sorts of reasons that we don't serve as God has told us to. If we look to God, we're like, I can't do this, but God can do it through me, and I'm going to trust Him. And so we step forward in faith. Faith not in ourselves, confidence trusting in God. Because we know what God is like. He's a loving God and a good God and a faithful God, and He's merciful. Will we be perfect? No. Will we produce great results? God knows. Can we be faithful? Trusting God for the results, trusting in the promises of God. Yes. So the word for us today is trust God, take one step forward. Look to God, step forward in obedience. Doesn't need to be a giant step, just a little step. God could have sent someone else. God sent Moses. God could have saved someone else. But He saved you. And if He saved you, then He sent you. How are you going to respond? How am I going to respond? God will be faithful. God will be merciful. And we rest upon that.